names one person. All our common names, they're universals. Our concepts are all universal in character. Now, the point about the universal is it cannot be in matter. Let me take for a moment two almost perfectly identical ball bearings, indistinguishable. Why do you say they're two? Because one occupies this space, one occupies that. If they occupied the same space, there'd be one, wouldn't they? Because every respect identical. What makes them two is matter. Matter can't, two units of matter can't be in the same place. So matter, the Middle Ages were very, very smart when they said matter is the principle of individuation. Now, if we thought with our brains, we could only do this as we see with our eyes, we imagine with our, you can't, for example, you and I can't imagine a triangle. You can imagine a scalene triangle, an equilateral triangle, a right triangle, a large triangle, a small triangle, a blue triangle, a green triangle. Everything you imagine is particularized.
It's shaped, yeah.
If you try to imagine triangle itself, you can't do it. Why can't you do it? Because to think triangle, you don't have to use your brain. If you use your brain to think, like use your brain to imagine, you use your brain and your eyes in your brain, your ears in your brain to see. Everything you see, imagine, remember in a sensitive fashion is always particular.
But this is only when you're dealing with universals, right? What about, say, God? Is he universal?
Definitely so.
Well, what about when you think God?
Well, God is not a concept in the ordinary sense. God is an extraordinary intellectual construct. That's a very hard term. In fact, God is not a universal. God is a proper name in a sense. If I would substitute a phrase for God, I would say the supreme being who created the cosmos. That refers to one supreme being. So that is like a proper name, like the President of the United States in 1990. So God is not, it's a very special concept.
So you're taxonomizing him uniquely.
That's right.
Yeah. So in that sense, you can't think God in a multiplicity.
No.
Yeah. But the whole idea of monotheism.
No, we talk about divinities.
Yes.
Divinity is a universal term.
Yeah. But now, when you say that, having established that intellect is the mind over matter, you prescind it from the brain.
Yes.
And assign to it, therefore, what function that would be considered uncommon by a naturalist or a philosophical materialist.
Well, I would say that human thinking, the kind of thinking that computers can't do. My strongest argument is against the notion of reducing the brain, the human thinking to a computer. AI, the artificial intelligence boys think they're going to produce. They still haven't done it, but they think the future holds the promise of a machine that will be indistinguishable in performance from a human being.
Yeah, electronic thought.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's impossible because, see, if the brain were the organ of thought, they could do it. Because I think they can replicate the brain in another material organ. But if the intellect and not the brain is the organ of thought, they will not be able to produce a machine that can do specifically human thinking. And I make a point about that. All logical thought is mechanical. They can produce machines that would be logical. But the wonderful thing about human thought is it's not logical. We can be logical, but all of our great leaps of
acts of transcendence.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, you're not telling me, are you, because I read a little bit of this stuff, that there are people around who are saying that they can develop a computer that will give you a response which you hadn't pre-fed it, are they?
No. They talk about the computer having access to randomness, but
like the monkeys who type out Hamlet.
Yeah, that's right. But the way you can imagine this is, suppose you took an ocean voyage that lasted, let's say, 2 months, and you had a deck chair, and someone was sitting next to you, and you met every morning for morning bouillon on the deck, and you talked to this fellow next to you every day for 2 hours. Could you predict on any day what the turn of the conversation would be the next day? You couldn't. In a long...
Well, you couldn't with certitude.
No.
But you could with high probability.
But
Hydro.
Nevertheless, there'd be all kinds of surprises, wouldn't there?
Yeah.
He or you would say something that you hadn't thought of before. In other words, a long human conversation is unprogrammable. You couldn't program it. It's unpredictable.
You mean you couldn't program it in terms of logical succession, or you couldn't program it anyway?
You couldn't program a computer to do it, for example. In other words,
I can think of a lot of Democrats I could program.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. But if there were a screen between you and the next fellow next to you on the deck chair,
yeah.
The question is, could you tell whether you were having this conversation with a machine or a human being?
Yeah.
I think you always could. I think you always could tell whether the conversation was between you. By the way, suppose there were no voices involved. Everything was transmitted by printout. You could ask any question you wanted. Keep on asking them. Course of 2 months. I think you'd soon, if it ever happened, that you could say, I don't know, I really don't, 50-50, I can't tell whether it's a machine I'm talking to or a human being. I'd be wrong. I'd tear it all up.
Right.
But I think that will never happen. In other words, I think the indiscernibility of a machine from a human being is never going to happen. The machines will never function so that they will be indiscernible from human beings. And the reason for that is, that's the importance of this thing, is the immateriality of the intellect. If the brain did the job, I'd be wrong.
Okay, let me just close down on this. Suppose I were here, the naturalist, and I were to say to you, the brain is competent to make responses so copious that it is inconceivable that we could ever program it to reply to every contingent question you might ask it. Under the circumstances, won't it always surprise you, even if it were simply the brain itself rather than the intellect?
But if it were the brain itself, that's the other side of the argument. In terms of what matter does, if it's the brain, you would have no universal concepts whatsoever. I'm saying the brain cannot be an organ which operates with universals, because matter, I repeat now about the triangle. Why is it you can't imagine triangle as such? Why do any picture you call before your mind a triangle will be of some shape, size, and color?
Yeah, there's a wonderful exchange in Huckleberry Finn between the old darky, the old Negro, Jim, who's illiterate, and either Huck or Tom Sawyer says to him, you know, in France, the word for cow is vache. And he says, well, how can that be? A cow is a cow. How can it be other things? And this was really an instruction in universals to an illiterate, wasn't it?
That's right.
Now, are you saying that this would be an indication of the working of the intellect, because he could imagine?
No, it is the fact that if you could not rise above your imagination, you could not think triangle. You could imagine triangles at the end of time. They'd always be of some shape, size, and color. But just think of, think of God for a moment. You can't imagine
Is that constitutional?
It's quite constitutional. And you can't, the reason why most people have trouble with God and have, I had great difficulty with in church, with people who think that heaven is a place, for example. Now, if God is a purely spiritual being, God does not exist in any physical place whatsoever. There's a state of being, which is the divine, but not a place. And when you can only think, one of the reasons why the great Jewish theologian, Maimonides, and St. Thomas, following the rabbi, insisted upon negative theology is because you cannot positively think of God. People who imagine God anthropomorphize God, as the artists do, of course. You have to think of God negatively, incorruptible, non-temporal, immaterial, immutable. Look at all those negative words. And when you think of God positive, there are three positive things you can say about God. God lives, God knows, and God wills.
God lives or God exists?
God exists is... Whenever you say God exists, lives, wills, and knows, you have to immediately add, but not as you and I exist, not as you and I live, not as you and I know, not as you and I will. That not comes in there, because if you don't do that, you're saying that the word live is applied univocally, in the same sense to God and you.
Well, but does the Christian have this problem with the incarnation?
That's a very difficult problem. Very difficult. But you're way ahead of me now. The problem with the incarnation is a Christian mystery.
Yeah.
More complicated than the problem of the intellect and God. What the incarnation is in the creed is one substance of two natures. That's difficult to think. But there's a reason for that, Bill. If you asked yourself, why did God reveal anything to us? As Christians and Jews think that we have a divine revelation in sacred scripture, correct? Would God have revealed anything to us that we could that we could normally think by ourselves? No, it would be a waste of time, wouldn't it? So what he revealed is something we can't really understand very well.
Well, then he didn't reveal it very well.
No. The limitation is ours. That is, the finite, the infinite talking to the finite is an interesting kind of jump across a bridge.
Well, you're saying that the revelation ex natura has to be inscrutable?
Difficult to Maritain said the mysteries, the Christian mysteries, are intelligible in themselves, but not to us completely. And that I think, proper for divine revelation.
You know, you can concede their internal coherence without conceding their intelligibility.
That's right.
To what extent does this independent intellect, the mind over matter, to what extent is it critical for approaching revelation or understanding it? Or
I assure you, you couldn't even begin to think about it if the materialists were correct. If the brain is the organ of thought, not just the organ of sense and imagination and memory. See, I say it is an organ. Very important, though. Without it, we couldn't think at all. Without it, we couldn't think at all. We don't think with it. If the brain were the organ we thought with, I think we wouldn't have any way at all of even stating the mysteries of the Christian religion.
How did Santayana handle that problem? By simply dismissing it as poetry?
Yes. One phrase he used in Life of Reason, Religion, Reason and Religion, is to say that religion is the poetry in which you believe. I think that is a false statement.
Excuse me. Mr. Buckley, I didn't realize until today that dolphins have souls.
Potatoes do, too.
Well, let me ask you then, that being the case, why is Dr. Adler so completely confident that dolphins don't have intellects? What is it that is uniquely human about this non-material aspect of thought?
No activity. The dolphins communicate with one another, that they are very intelligent. The word intellect and intelligence are not the same. The dolphins are more intelligent than chimpanzees, I think, are clear. Their brain-body ratio is the highest next to man. But all the perceptual activities of the dolphins, imaginative perception, are not intellectual.
How do you know?
Well,
how do you know they're not swimming around thinking about triangles?
I don't know. I don't know. In a sense, I can't say, but there's no evidence of it positively. You say, how do I don't know it in the sense that I have direct evidence that they're not intellectual. But I've never met an intellectual dolphin. Have you?
And so is anti-intellectualism one proof that the intellect is something larger than the brain?
No. It's one proof that man is the only anti-intellectual animal. There's no evidence that dolphins are anti-intellectual, or pigs or horses are either.
What about potatoes?
No, they are definitely not. And if you think about that a long time, you'll see that the peculiar characteristic of man with an intellect is that lots of anti-intellectual men, human beings.
Think about that a long time.
Yeah. We're going to puzzle it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mortimer Adler, author of, most recently of Intellect, Mind Over Matter.